disturbing. Tonight, we are plunging into the dark heart of the Appalachian Mountains with some truly unsettling true horror stories that will keep you up all night, if you're brave enough. Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into fear. Now, get comfortable, relax. My name is Samuel Clark, and I've spent the better part of 37 years trying to forget the sound of my father's voice calling my name through the mountain mist. It's been 3 months since we buried an empty coffin in Millfield Cemetery. 3 months since the search parties gave up looking for Thomas Clark in the labyrinthine depths of Crow's Hollow Mine. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, another casualty of these unforgiving Appalachian peaks that have swallowed so many before him. But I know better. I know he's still down there, somewhere in that accursed pit that has haunted our family for generations. The last time I saw my father alive, he was standing at the kitchen window of our childhood home, staring up at the ridge, where the old mine entrance yawns like a wound in the mountainside. His weathered hands trembled as he gripped his coffee mug, and his usually steady voice cracked when he told me he was going hunting, alone, for the first time in years. I should have known something was wrong then. Pa never hunted alone, not since I was a boy, and he'd take me along to teach me the ways of the woods. But grief makes fools of us all, and I was too wrapped up in my own troubles to see the signs. The stories about Crow's Hollow have been whispered in these mountains since before my grandfather's time. Locals speak of it in hushed tones at the general store, their voices dropping to barely audible murmurs when children are present. They tell of miners who went down into the earth in the 1920s and never came back up, of strange lights that dance in the tunnel mouths on moonless nights, and of voices that echo from the depths, voices of the lost, calling for others to join them in their eternal darkness. My father knew these stories better than most. The Clark family has deep roots in these mountains, stretching back to the coal boom days when desperate men carved wealth from stone and shadow. Great-grandfather Ezra Clark was one of the original miners at Crow's Hollow, before the collapse of 24 sealed the main shaft and left 17 men entombed in the mountain's belly. The official records say it was a gas explosion, but the survivors told different tales, stories of things they saw moving in the deeper tunnels, of whispers that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Now, as autumn paints the mountains in shades of rust and gold, I find myself packing supplies for a journey I've dreaded my entire life. The local sheriff has closed the case, the insurance company has paid out, and everyone expects me to move on, to let the mountain keep its secrets. But the dreams won't let me rest. Every night I hear him calling, his voice echoing through endless stone corridors that seem to stretch into the very heart of the earth. Sometimes I wake to find mud on my boots and pine needles in my hair, as if I've been walking the mountain paths in my sleep, drawn inexorably toward that gaping maw of shadow and stone. The morning I decided to return to Crow's Hollow dawned, gray and cold, with a bitter wind that cut through the valley like a blade. I loaded my truck with rope, flashlights, and enough supplies for several days, though something deep in my bones told me this journey would end one way or another before nightfall. As I drove the winding mountain roads toward the mine, memories of my childhood flooded back. Summers spent exploring these same paths with Pa, listening to his stories about the old days, feeling safe and small beneath the vast canopy of ancient oaks and pines. But today the forest feels different. The trees seem to lean inward, their branches reaching across the narrow road like gnarled fingers trying to bar my passage. The usual sounds of wildlife are absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighs heavy on my chest. Even the wind seems muted, as if the very air itself is holding its breath. The old mining road is barely visible now, overgrown with thorny underbrush and marked only by the rusted remains of warning signs that have long since lost their words to weather and time. My truck can only take me so far before the path becomes too narrow, too treacherous for anything but foot travel. As I shoulder my pack and begin the final approach to Crow's Hollow, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something in these ancient woods is aware of my presence and finds it amusing. The entrance to the mine appears suddenly, Through the trees, a black mouth rimmed with rotting timber that seems to swallow light itself. Standing before it now, with the weight of family history pressing down on my shoulders and the echo of my father's voice still ringing in my ears, I understand that I'm about to cross a threshold from which there may be no return. But the choice was made the moment they lowered that empty coffin into the ground. Whatever waits for me in the darkness below, whatever truth lies buried in the heart of Crow's Hollow, I will face it. The mountain wind picks up as I take my first step toward the entrance, and for just a moment, I could swear I hear my name being called from somewhere deep within the earth. The first thing that strikes you about Crow's Hollow isn't the darkness, it's the smell. A combination of stagnant water, rust, and something else, something organic and wrong that coats the back of your throat like oil. My flashlight beam cuts through the gloom as I make my way past the collapsed support beams that frame the entrance like the ribs of some massive, long-dead beast. The wooden planks are swollen with decades of moisture, covered in a slick film of moss and decay that makes them treacherous underfoot. 20 feet into the tunnel, the last traces of natural light fade completely, leaving me in a world of shifting shadows and dancing beam-swept walls. The passage slopes downward at a gentle angle, wide enough for the old mining carts that once hauled coal from these depths. Rusted rail tracks still run along the floor, disappearing into the black throat of the mountain like parallel lines drawn into infinity. The walls tell stories in a language of pick marks and time. Layers of sediment and coal seams create a geological timeline that stretches back millions of years. But it's the human marks that draw my attention. Scratched into the stone and timber are initials, dates, and crude drawings left by men who worked these tunnels when they were alive, with purpose and promise. Some of the dates go back to the mine's opening in 1919, others are more recent, too recent. Among them, I find what I'm looking for and what I'm dreading in equal measure. TC 2024, carved deep into a support beam, the letters still sharp and fresh. Pa was here. Recently, as I venture deeper, the tunnel branches and splits like arteries, spreading through a body. Some passages are blocked by cave-ins, their entrances sealed with warning tape that has faded to ghostly white streamers in the darkness. Others yawn open, exhaling currents of cold air that carry whispers of sound, dripping water, settling timber, and something else that might be wind but feels too purposeful, too rhythmic to be natural. I follow the main shaft, guided by the rails and by an instinct I can't quite name. The temperature drops steadily as I descend, and my breath begins to mist in the beam of my flashlight. The walls grow slick with condensation, and strange formations of mineral deposits create twisted sculptures that cast grotesque shadows in the moving light. Some look almost organic, like crystallized remains of creatures that never should have existed. It's in a wider chamber, perhaps 200 yards from the entrance, that I find the first of the symbols. They're carved into the stone wall with deliberate precision, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Not pictographs or letters from any alphabet I recognize, but something older, more primitive. The cuts are deep and precise, made with tools heavier than the simple picks and chisels the miners would have carried. When I run my fingers over them, the stone feels warm to the touch, as if the symbols themselves generate some kind of heat. Beneath the symbols, scattered on the chamber floor, are personal effects that make my blood run cold. A hunting knife, with an elk bone handle, Pa's knife, the one he'd carried since his teenage years. A torn piece of flannel that matches the shirt he was wearing when he left the house 3 months ago. And strangest of all, a pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle around a depression in the floor that looks almost like an altar, worn smooth by countless hands. The circle of stones is old, older than the mine itself, I'd guess. The rocks are native to these mountains, but placed with an intentionality that speaks of ritual, of purpose beyond simple construction. Inside the circle, the floor is stained dark with something that isn't coal dust or mineral seepage. When I shine my light directly on it, the stains seem to shimmer and move, as if they're still wet after all these years. That's when I hear the first voice. It comes from deeper in the mine, echoing off tunnel walls in a way that makes it impossible to determine direction or distance. At first I think it might be another searcher, someone else looking for answers in these depths. But as I listen more carefully, the voice becomes familiar in a way that makes my skin crawl. It's my father's voice, but wrong somehow, distorted by distance and acoustics into something that sounds almost but not quite human. He's calling my name just as he has in my dreams, but there's something different in the tone. Where the dream voice carried notes of desperation and pleading, this voice carries something else entirely. Invitation, anticipation, hunger. I follow the sound deeper into the mine, past chambers filled with rusted equipment and forgotten tools, past side tunnels that breathe cold air and whisper with sounds that might be wind or might be something else entirely. The main shaft continues its relentless descent, and with each step, the voices grow stronger, more distinct. Not just my father's voice now, but others. Men's voices, women's voices, children's voices, all calling from the depths in languages I don't recognize and words I pray I never understand. The rails end at another chamber, this one larger than any I've seen, its ceiling lost in darkness above my flashlight's reach. The walls are covered in more symbols, these ones spreading across the stone like an infection, growing more complex and disturbing the further they extend. In the center of the chamber stands a structure that shouldn't exist, a series of stone pillars arranged in concentric circles, carved with the same symbols that cover the walls, but worn smooth by age and handling. Between the pillars, the floor drops away into what appears to be a natural sinkhole, though the edges are too regular, too purposeful to be entirely natural. The pit descends beyond the reach of my light, and from its depths comes a sound that makes every instinct scream at me to run. A rhythmic pulsing, like the heartbeat of something vast and patient and utterly alien to this world. It's then that I see the rope. A modern climbing rope, the kind sold at outdoor supply stores, is anchored to one of the stone pillars and disappears into the pit. The rope is new, maybe 3 months old at most, and I recognize the knotwork, pause knots, tied with the same precision he taught me as a boy. At the edge of the pit, partially hidden beneath a fall of loose stone, I find his pack. Inside are his camping supplies, his compass, and a journal filled with entries that become increasingly erratic and illegible as they progress. The final entry, dated just 3 days before he was reported missing, contains only a single line, repeated over and over in handwriting that barely resembles his own. They're calling me home. They're calling me home. They're calling me home. As I stare into that pit, listening to the rhythmic pulsing that seems to sync with my own heartbeat, I understand that whatever happened to my father didn't end with his disappearance. It began with it. The mine isn't just a tomb, it's a doorway, and something on the other side has been very patient, waiting for the right moment to extend its invitation to the next generation of Clarks. The voices are getting louder now, more insistent, and among them I can clearly hear my father calling my name. But I'm beginning to understand that the thing wearing his voice isn't him at all. It's something that learned to mimic him, something that has been practicing for months getting ready for my arrival. The rope hangs there like a challenge, an invitation to join the family business that has been passed down through generations of Clarks. And despite every rational thought screaming at me to run, to flee this place and never return, I find my hands already reaching for the rope, already testing its strength. Because somewhere in the darkness below, something that sounds exactly like my father is calling me home. The descent into the pit feels like falling through layers of time itself. Each foot of rope I traverse takes me further from the world I know and deeper into something that exists outside the natural order. My flashlight beam penetrates perhaps 20 feet into the darkness below before being swallowed entirely, as if the blackness down there is a living thing that devours light as hungrily as it devours everything else. The walls of the pit are carved with symbols that grow more complex and disturbing as I descend. Not carved, I realize, burned into the stone, as if the rock itself had been branded with these alien hieroglyphs by some unimaginable heat. They seem to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into new configurations when I'm not looking directly at them. 50 feet down, I reach a ledge that opens into another chamber, this one clearly not of human construction. The walls curve and flow like they were shaped by water rather than tools, and the ceiling stretches up into darkness that my light cannot penetrate. But it's what fills the chamber that stops my breath and nearly sends me scrambling back up. The rope. Bodies. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds, arranged in concentric circles around the chamber floor. But these aren't the remains of miners who died in cave-ins or gas explosions. These bodies show no signs of trauma, no evidence of violent death. They simply lie where they fell, arranged with ritualistic precision, their faces turned toward the center of the chamber where something waits in the darkness. And they're not old. Some of these bodies are recent, clothing I recognize from the past few decades, watches still ticking on skeletal wrists, wedding rings that haven't yet tarnished. Among them, I find answers to questions that have haunted these mountains for generations. Missing hikers, hunters who never returned, children who wandered too far into the woods and were never found. They're all here, all part of whatever harvest this place has been conducting for longer than anyone can remember. In the center of the arrangement, I find him. My father sits with his back against a natural pillar of stone, his eyes closed as if he's simply sleeping. But when I approach, when I reach out to touch his shoulder, his eyes open and fix on mine, with an intelligence that is both absolutely him and completely alien. His mouth moves, forming words in a voice that carries harmonics no human throat should be able to produce. "You came," he says, and his voice echoes from every surface in the chamber, as if the stone itself is speaking. "I knew you would. The Clark blood always calls to the deep places, Samuel. Always has. Always will." I want to run, want to climb back up that rope and never stop running until I'm far from these mountains and their hungry shadows. But something holds me frozen in place. Something that might be love, or might be the same force that has been calling to my family for generations. "Pa," I whisper, though I already know the answer won't be what I want to hear. "He's here," the thing wearing my father's face replies. "All of them are here. All of them are part of it now, part of the deep song that keeps the world from remembering what it used to be. Do you want to see?" Before I can answer, the chamber fills with a sound like singing, but singing in frequencies that human ears weren't designed to process. The air itself begins to shimmer, and suddenly I can see them. Not just the bodies arranged on the chamber floor, but the translucent forms that rise from each corpse, connected by threads of light that pulse with that same rhythmic heartbeat. I heard from above. They're all connected, all part of a vast network that extends beyond this chamber, beyond this mine, threading through the mountain itself and reaching toward other places, other networks, other harvests that have been going on for millennia. And at the center of it all, something vast and patient and utterly inhuman pulses with satisfaction at each new addition to its collection. My father, or the thing that remembers being my father, extends one hand toward me, and I can see the threads of light that connect him to the network, threads that writhe like living things, eager to make new connections. "The mine was never about coal," he explains, his voice now coming from multiple throats at once, a chorus of the harvested speaking in unison. "It was about providing access, about giving it a way to reach the surface world without having to leave the deep places where it's strongest. Every family that worked these tunnels, every generation that sent their sons into the darkness, we were all just gardeners, tending to its crop. I understand now why the symbols hurt to look at, why the voices called with such patient hunger. This thing, whatever it is, doesn't just consume bodies. It harvests connections, relationships, the bonds between people that give life meaning. It feeds on love perverted into compulsion, on family ties that become chains dragging the living down to join the dead. You can fight it." My father's voice continues, though now I can hear other voices layered beneath it. My grandfather's voice, great-grandfather Ezra's voice, generations of Clarks who have made this same choice in this same chamber. "But you'll lose, just like we all lost, because the alternative is leaving me here alone, and you can't do that, can you? You can't abandon family." The threads of light reach toward me now, and I can feel their pull, not just physical but emotional, spiritual. They promise reunion, promise an end to the loneliness and grief that have consumed me since Pa disappeared. They promise answers to questions I've carried my whole life, understanding of mysteries that have haunted my family for generations, and they promise that I'll never have to leave him again. But in that moment of ultimate temptation, I remember something my father taught me when I was young, a lesson about the difference between love and possession, between loyalty and slavery. The real Thomas Clark, the man who raised me and taught me to be strong, would never ask me to give up my freedom for his sake. He would want me to live, to break the cycle that has claimed so many of our bloodline. With strength I didn't know I possessed, I tear my gaze away from those reaching threads of light and run. Behind me, the chorus of voices rises to a shriek of frustration and rage, and I can hear something massive stirring in the deeper parts of the network, something that hasn't had to move in a very long time but is now very, very angry. The climb back up the rope is a nightmare of grasping shadows and voices that promise terrible things if I don't turn back, wonderful things if I do. My hands burn from the friction, my lungs burn from the effort, but I don't stop climbing until I burst out of that pit and into the chamber above, where the symbols on the walls now glow with an angry red light. I run through the tunnels as they collapse behind me, tons of stone and timber crashing down to seal the passages I've just traversed. The mountain itself seems to be trying to prevent my escape, but I know these woods, know these paths better than the thing that's chasing me. I reach my truck just as the sun is setting, painting the sky the color of blood. I drive away from Crow's Hollow and don't stop until I reach the county line, but I know it's not over. In the rearview mirror, I can see lights dancing in the trees where the mine entrance should be, and sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I can hear voices calling my name from the direction of the mountains. I've moved to the city now, gotten a job in an office building where the only tunnels are for subway trains and the only darkness is the shadow cast by skyscrapers, but the dreams haven't stopped. If anything, they've gotten stronger, more insistent. And sometimes I wake to find mud on my shoes and the smell of coal dust in my hair, even though I'm hundreds of miles from those mountains. The thing in Crow's Hollow is patient. It has been patient for longer than human civilization has existed, and it can wait a little longer. But I know that someday, somehow, it will call in the debt that every Clark owes to the deep places. The harvest isn't over, it's just been postponed, and sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I wonder if it might not be easier to just go back, to take that long walk up the mountain one final time and join the family business that has been waiting for me my entire life. The voices are always there now, just at the edge of hearing, reminding me that I can't run forever, that blood calls to blood, and the deep places never forget their own. They're calling me home. I was 16 when my father disappeared into the Appalachian wilderness, and 27 when I finally understood that some questions are never meant to have answers. But that autumn morning when he and Uncle Lee left for their annual hunting trip, I believed in certainties, in the reliability of sunrise, in the steady rhythm of seasons, and in the promise that those we love will always find their way home. Our family had always been bound to the mountains. 3 generations of Harpers had hunted these ridges, fished these streams, and walked these ancient trails that wind through the Blue Ridge like veins through weathered hands. My father, Daniel Harper, could read the forest like scripture. Every broken twig told a story. Every track revealed a secret. Every shift in the wind carried messages from miles away. He taught me that the woods were alive, that they watched and remembered, and that if you listened carefully enough, they would share their wisdom with you. That October morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that makes photographers weep and hunters' hearts race. I watched from the kitchen window as Dad loaded his rifle and gear into the truck bed, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this hundreds of times before. Uncle Lee arrived just after sunrise, his own equipment already packed, a thermos of coffee steaming in his gloved hands. "You sure you don't want to come along, kiddo?" Dad called to me as I stood on the porch, still in my pajamas and robe. It was the same invitation he extended every year, and like every year since I'd turned 14, I declined. School was important, I told myself. I had tests to study for, papers to write. The truth was that hunting had begun to feel different. To me, less like communion with nature and more like an intrusion into something sacred and private. Uncle Lee laughed and ruffled my hair as he passed. "Your loss, sport. These old mountains are putting on quite a show this year." He gestured toward the ridgeline where the maples and oaks blazed scarlet against the pewter sky. "By the time we get back, half those leaves will be on the ground." They were heading to a section of the George Washington National Forest that Dad had been hunting since he was my age, a remote area accessible only by a network of old logging roads that had been abandoned decades ago. It was wild country, the kind of place where cell phones became expensive paperweights and civilization felt like a distant memory. But Dad knew it like his own backyard, could navigate those tangled hollows and limestone ridges blindfolded. "We'll be back Sunday night," he promised, kissing my mother goodbye and squeezing my shoulder. "Monday morning at the latest if the weather turns." He looked up at the sky, where high clouds were beginning to gather like gossip. "Might get some rain by weekend's end." I watched their truck disappear around the bend in our gravel driveway, red taillights winking between the trees like dying embers. Something cold settled in my stomach as the sound of the engine faded, a feeling I couldn't name but couldn't shake. Later I would learn to call it premonition. The first day passed normally enough. Mom busied herself with autumn cleaning, and I buried myself in schoolwork, occasionally glancing out my bedroom window toward the mountain where I imagined Dad and Uncle Lee were setting up their camp. Saturday brought gray skies and the first drops of the promised rain, but nothing that would concern experienced outdoorsmen. They'd weathered far worse storms in those mountains. Sunday evening came and went without the familiar sound of Dad's truck in the driveway. Mom paced the house like a caged animal, checking her watch every few minutes and peering out windows as if she could summon them home through sheer force of will. "They probably decided to wait out the rain," she said, more to herself than to me. "You know how your father is about driving those mountain roads in bad weather." But Monday morning brought only silence. Then Tuesday. By Wednesday, the knot in my stomach had grown into something alive and clawing, feeding on my mother's barely contained panic and the increasingly frequent phone calls to the sheriff's office. Something was wrong, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. The official search began Thursday morning. Sheriff Caldwell organized teams of volunteers, park rangers, and local hunting guides to comb the area where Dad and Uncle Lee were supposed to be camping. I begged to join them, but Mom insisted I stay home, maintain some semblance of normalcy, keep up with my schoolwork, as if the world hadn't tilted sideways. For 3 days, I sat by the phone waiting for news that never came. The searchers found their campsite easily enough. Dad's orange tent still standing, their gear neatly organized, a cold fire ring surrounded by folding chairs. But there was no sign of the men themselves, no indication of where they had gone or why they hadn't returned. It was Uncle Lee who called that Sunday night, his voice shaking with exhaustion and something deeper, something that sounded like fear. "We found Daniel's hunting pack," he said without preamble, "about 2 miles from camp, near an old mine shaft we'd never seen before. The pack was just sitting there, like he'd set it down for a minute and walked away." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, Uncle Lee continued, his words careful and measured. "We're calling off the search until morning. The weather's turning again, and it's not safe to be up there in the dark. But we'll find him, kiddo. We'll bring him home." But even as he said the words, I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice, the gradual erosion of certainty that comes when the wilderness swallows someone you love and offers no explanation in return. I pressed the phone to my ear until it hurt, straining to hear some trace of my father and Uncle Lee's breathing, some whispered reassurance that everything would be all right. Instead, I heard only the wind moving through trees that suddenly seemed vast and hungry and full of secrets they would never share. The morning I finally convinced Mom to let me join the search dawned gray and sullen, with low clouds clinging to the ridgelines like funeral shrouds. Uncle Lee picked me up before sunrise, and I could see the weight of the past week etched in the lines around his eyes. He'd aged years in the span of days, his usual easy smile replaced by a grim determination that felt foreign on his weathered face. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked as we drove the winding mountain roads toward the search area. "These woods aren't the same ones you played in as a kid. They can be unforgiving." I nodded, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The familiar landmarks of my childhood, the old barn with the rusted roof, the creek where Dad taught me to fish, the meadow where we'd once seen a bear and her cubs, all looked different now, touched by an indefinable wrongness that made my skin crawl. The parking area at the trailhead was crowded with search and rescue vehicles, their red and blue lights painting the morning mist in carnival colors that felt obscene against the solemnity of our purpose. Sheriff Caldwell briefed the assembled volunteers with military precision, dividing us into teams and assigning grid patterns to ensure no area went unchecked twice. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying easily across the assembled group, "we're not just looking for Daniel Harper anymore. We're looking for any sign of human passage, broken branches, footprints, disturbed ground. This wilderness has a way of hiding things, but nothing disappears without leaving some trace." Uncle Lee and I were assigned to search a section of forest about 3 miles from Dad's campsite, following a ridge that curved around a deep hollow filled with ancient hemlocks and rhododendron thickets. The beauty of the place was undeniable. Cathedral light filtering through the canopy, moss-covered boulders that looked like sleeping giants, streams that sang their way down the mountainside toward distant valleys. But there was something else. There too, something that raised the hair on the back of my neck and made me constantly glance over my shoulder. The forest felt watched, as if unseen eyes tracked our every movement from the shadows between the trees. Birds fell silent as we passed, and the usual sounds of small animals rustling through the underbrush were conspicuously absent. "You feel it too," Uncle Lee said after we'd been walking for an hour. It wasn't a question. I nodded, grateful that someone else had noticed the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to thicken with each step we took deeper into the wilderness. "It's like the woods are angry," I said, struggling to find words for the sensation. Uncle Lee stopped walking and looked around, his experienced hunter's eyes scanning the forest with an intensity I'd never seen before. "I've been hunting these mountains for 30 years, he said quietly, "and I've never felt anything like this. It's like something is watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake." We pressed on, calling Dad's name until our voices were hoarse, but the forest swallowed our shouts without even the courtesy of an echo. The trees seemed to lean closer together as we climbed, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more and more of the sky. By midday, we were walking in perpetual twilight, our flashlights cutting pale cones through the gloom. It was Uncle Lee who spotted the markings first, scratches in the bark of an old oak tree that were too deliberate, too purposeful to be natural. They formed symbols that hurt to look at directly, angular patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Below the marked tree, the ground was disturbed, scuffed as if something had been dragged across the forest floor. "Jesus," Uncle Lee whispered, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "What the hell did that?" The symbols were carved deep into the bark, made with something sharper and more precise than any animal's claws. They reminded me of the pictographs I'd seen in history books, primitive communications left by people who had no written language. But these felt older somehow, more alien, as if they'd been made by minds that thought in ways human consciousness couldn't comprehend. We followed the disturbed ground for another half-mile, through thickets so dense we had to crawl on hands and knees, past streams that ran dark with tannins and reflected no light at all. The trail led steadily upward toward a part of the mountain I'd never explored, where the trees grew stunted and twisted and the very air seemed to hum with an energy that made my teeth ache. That's when we found the mine. It appeared suddenly through the trees, a black mouth cut into the mountainside and framed by rotting timber that looked far older than any mining operation I knew of in the area. The entrance was partially collapsed, but wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he was determined, or desperate enough. "I've never seen this before," Uncle Lee said, his voice tight with confusion and growing fear. "I've hunted every inch of this mountain, and I swear to God, this mine wasn't here last month." The ground around the entrance was churned with footprints, some recognizably human, others that defied easy classification. Among them, I found the distinctive tread pattern of Dad's hiking boots, pressed deep into the mud as if he'd been running, or being chased. Uncle Lee shone his flashlight into the mine entrance, but the beam seemed to die just a few feet into the tunnel, swallowed by darkness that felt solid and hungry. From somewhere deep in that blackness came a sound that raised every hair on my body, a rhythmic scraping, like something large being dragged across stone. "We need to call the sheriff," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when my hands were shaking like leaves. But Uncle Lee was already moving toward the entrance, drawn by some compulsion I could see warring with his common sense. "He might be in there," he said. "Daniel might be trapped, waiting for us to find him." I wanted to argue, wanted to grab his arm and drag him away from that accursed hole in the mountain. But the hope in his voice, the desperate need to believe that Dad was still alive and waiting to be rescued, kept me silent. We'd come too far to turn back now, searched too long to walk away without answers. Uncle Lee squeezed through the entrance first, his flashlight beam dancing wildly as he disappeared into the tunnel. I followed reluctantly, my skin crawling, as the mountain seemed to close around me like a tomb. The air inside was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of rust and decay and something else. Something organic and wrong that coated the back of my throat like oil. 20 feet into the tunnel, Uncle Lee stopped so suddenly that I collided with his back. His flashlight had gone out, and in the absolute darkness that followed, I could hear his breathing, fast and shallow, like a trapped animal's. "Uncle Lee," I whispered, fumbling for my own light. When my flashlight finally flickered to life, I saw why he'd stopped. The tunnel ahead was filled with more of those symbols, carved into every surface until the walls looked like pages from some blasphemous text. And scattered on the ground, as if dropped by someone fleeing in panic, were pieces of Dad's clothing, his hunting jacket, his gloves, his lucky hat that he'd worn on every hunting trip for as long as I could remember. But Uncle Lee wasn't looking at the artifacts. He was staring deeper into the tunnel, where my light couldn't reach, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. "We have to go," he said, his voice barely audible. "We have to go right now." That's when I heard it, footsteps echoing from the depths of the mine, slow and deliberate and definitely not human. Something was coming toward us through that impenetrable darkness, something that had been waiting for us to venture deep enough into its domain. Uncle Lee grabbed my arm and we ran, stumbling and falling over the uneven ground, our lights dancing crazily off the symbol-covered walls. Behind us, the footsteps quickened, accompanied now by a sound like breathing, but too deep, too slow, too measured to belong to any living thing I could imagine. We burst from the mine entrance into afternoon light that felt like salvation, gasping and shaking as if we'd surfaced from drowning. But even as we ran down the mountain, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs in our haste to reach the search base, I could feel eyes watching us from the darkness of that tunnel entrance. Something had been in there with us. Something had our scent now, knew our faces, understood that we'd seen too much. And somewhere in that network of tunnels carved into the living rock of the mountain, my father was either dead or something far worse. The search parties gathered at the mine entrance like pilgrims at a cursed shrine, their lights creating a constellation of false stars in the growing dusk. Sheriff Caldwell organized the volunteers with military precision, but even his authoritative voice couldn't quite mask the unease that had settled over the group like fog. Nobody wanted to go into that hole in the mountain, but nobody wanted to voice their fears either. Uncle Lee hadn't spoken since we'd stumbled out of the mine hours earlier. He sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, staring at the entrance, with eyes that held too much knowledge and not enough hope. When I tried to talk to him, he just shook his head and turned away, as if words had become foreign things that no longer served any useful purpose. "We go in teams of 3, Sheriff Caldwell announced, his flashlight beam sweeping across the assembled faces. "Nobody goes more than 100 yards into the main tunnel, and nobody ventures into side passages without radio contact with the base team. We're looking for Daniel Harper, but we're not taking any unnecessary risks. I watched the first team disappear into the mine entrance, their lights quickly swallowed by the darkness within. Minutes stretched into hours as we waited for word from the search teams, the silence broken only by the occasional crackle of radio static and the restless shifting of feet on loose gravel. When the first team emerged, their faces were pale and their voices tight with controlled panic. They'd found more of Dad's belongings scattered throughout the tunnel system. His compass, his knife, even his wallet with the family photo still tucked behind his driver's license. But there was no sign of Dad himself, no indication of where. He might have gone after discarding these pieces of his identity like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. The tunnels go deeper than we expected, the team leader reported to Sheriff Caldwell. Much deeper. And there are side passages that seem to go on forever. We could search for weeks and never cover all of them. As the second team prepared to enter the mine, Uncle Lee suddenly stood up from his log perch and walked toward me with purpose. His eyes had regained some of their focus, but there was something different about them now. A hardness I'd never seen before, as if he'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "I'm going back in there," he said quietly, so the others wouldn't overhear. "I know these mountains better than anyone, and I know Daniel better than anyone. If he's in there, I'll find him." I wanted to argue, wanted to remind him of the terror that had driven us both from the mine entrance hours earlier. But something in his voice, some note of finality, made me understand that this wasn't a discussion, it was a farewell. "I'm coming with you," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to run in the opposite direction. Uncle Lee shook his head. "This isn't your fight, kiddo. Whatever's in there, whatever happened to your father, it's something that's been waiting a long time for the Harper family to come calling. I won't let it claim another generation." Before I could protest further, he melted into the crowd of searchers and then, somehow, disappeared entirely. I searched the faces around the mine entrance, called his name until Sheriff Caldwell asked if I was all right. But Uncle Lee was simply gone, as if the mountain had opened up and swallowed him whole. The hours that followed blurred together, in a nightmare of radio calls that went unanswered, and search teams that found nothing but more symbols carved into stone and more pieces of discarded equipment that told a story nobody wanted to read. By midnight, Sheriff Caldwell made the decision to suspend the search until morning, citing safety concerns and the need for proper spelunking equipment to explore the deeper passages safely. But I couldn't leave, not with Dad still missing and Uncle Lee now gone too, swallowed by the same darkness that had claimed the man who taught me to read the woods like scripture. I waited until the last of the search vehicles had departed, then took my flashlight and approached the mine entrance alone. The symbols carved into the stone seemed to writhe in my light, rearranging themselves into new configurations that hurt to look at directly. The darkness beyond the entrance felt alive, pregnant with malevolent attention that focused on me like the gaze of some vast, hungry intelligence. I should have turned back then, should have walked down the mountain to where my mother waited with worry carved into every line of her face, should have accepted that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, some prices too high to pay for answers. Instead, I stepped into the tunnel. The beam of my flashlight penetrated perhaps 20 feet before being swallowed entirely, as if the darkness ahead was a living thing that devoured light as hungrily as it devoured everything else. The air grew thick and oppressive as I ventured deeper, heavy with the smell of rust and decay and something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach lurch with revulsion. I followed the main tunnel for what felt like miles, past side passages that exhaled cold air and whispered with sounds that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely. The symbols on the walls grew more complex and disturbing as I descended, until they covered every surface in a writhing tapestry of alien meaning that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. That's when I heard the voice. It came from somewhere ahead in the darkness, echoing off the tunnel walls in a way that made it impossible to determine distance or direction. At first I thought it might be another searcher, someone else who had ventured too deep into the mountain's hollow heart. But as I listened more carefully, the voice became familiar in a way that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was my father's voice, calling my name from the depths of the earth. I ran toward the sound, my flashlight beam dancing wildly off the carved walls as I stumbled over loose rocks and debris. The voice grew stronger, more distinct, calling not just my name now, but instructions, directions, promises that everything would be all right if I just kept walking, just kept following the sound deeper into the mountain's embrace. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness above my light's reach. And there, in the center of that hollow space, I found them. Dad and Uncle Lee stood together in perfect stillness, their backs turned to me, their heads tilted at angles that suggested they were listening to something I couldn't hear. They looked exactly as they had when they'd left for their hunting trip. Same clothes, same posture, same familiar silhouettes that had defined my understanding of safety and strength since childhood. "Dad!" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. In the vast space, they turned in unison, and in the beam of my flashlight, I saw their faces. They were my father and uncle, without question. Same features, same expressions I'd known all my life. But their eyes held a knowledge that was ancient and terrible, an understanding of truths that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. When they smiled at me, their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, as if they shared a single consciousness. "We've been waiting for you," they said in voices that harmonized in ways that made my teeth ache. "The Harper blood runs deep in these mountains, deeper than you know, deeper than anyone remembers." I wanted to run, wanted to flee back through the tunnels and never stop running until I was far from these mountains and their hungry shadows. But something held me frozen in place. Not fear, but recognition. Some part of me, some ancestral memory buried in the deepest parts of my DNA, understood that this moment had been inevitable from the day I was born. "What happened to you?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer wouldn't be something I wanted to hear. "We came home," Dad said, his voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat should be able to produce. "We remembered what the Harper family forgot, what we've been running from for generations. The mountains called us back, just like they called our fathers, and their fathers before them, just like they're calling you now." The chamber filled with a sound like singing, but in frequencies that human ears weren't designed to process. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with that alien rhythm, and I could see now that the symbols weren't carved into the stone. They were growing from it, spreading like an infection of meaning across every surface. "You can fight it, Uncle," Lee said, though his voice now came from multiple throats at once. "But you'll lose, just like we lost, because this is where the Harper bloodline belongs, where it's always belonged, in the deep places, where the old songs still remember how to be sung." They reached out to me with hands that cast no shadows in my flashlight beam, and I understood that whatever had taken my father and uncle wasn't just wearing their bodies, it was using their love for me as bait, perverting the bonds of family into chains that would drag me down into the same darkness that had claimed them. With strength I didn't know I possessed, I turned and ran. Behind me, the voices rose to a shriek of frustration that seemed to come from the mountain itself, a sound of rage so vast and ancient that it made the stone beneath my feet tremble. I ran through tunnels that tried to rearrange themselves around me, past symbols that blazed with angry light, while voices that sounded exactly like my father called my name with increasing desperation. I burst from the mine entrance into dawn light that felt like salvation, gasping and sobbing as if I'd surfaced from drowning. The search teams found me hours later, collapsed at the base of a tree with my clothes torn and my hands bleeding from clawing at rocks, babbling about voices in the dark and faces that weren't quite human anymore. The official report listed both my father and Uncle Lee as missing, presumed dead in an unexplored cave system. The mine entrance was sealed with concrete and warning signs, though the signs have a way of disappearing and the concrete develops cracks that seem to appear overnight. I moved away from the mountains after that. Got a job in a city where the tallest things are buildings made by human hands and the deepest darkness comes from streetlights failing. But the dreams haven't stopped. If anything, they've grown stronger, more insistent, filled with voices that sound exactly like family calling me home to a place I've never been but somehow remember. Sometimes, late at night when the city sleeps and the silence grows deep enough to hear your own heartbeat, I think I can hear them still. Dad and Uncle Lee calling my name from somewhere far beneath the earth, reminding me that blood calls to blood and that some debts can never be fully paid. The Harper family has roots in those mountains that go deeper than memory, deeper than history, deeper than any human record can trace. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Appalachian peaks, those roots are still growing, still reaching, still hungry for the next generation to come home and remember what we've spent so long trying to forget. They're waiting for me to return. They'll always be waiting. And someday, when the city noise finally stops being enough to drown out their voices, I know I'll pack a bag and drive those familiar mountain roads one last time, following the call that every Harper eventually answers. The mountains remember their own, and they never let their children go.